Hello, everyone. Welcome to another bounty episode. Wanted to say bounty and binary at the same time. Welcome to another bounty episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z. A bit of housekeeping before we get into topics here. 2 weeks from now, the 22nd and 23rd of May, will be our last episodes of the podcast for our summer break. Just wanted to give you all a heads up. As usual, we'll hope to have some other non-podcast related content come out over the summer, but the scheduled streams will be over until we return in the September, and we'll give you the exact dates on that next week and our last week. So, yeah. With
I,
that out of the way,
well, before we
go ahead,
jump
Z.
out, actually, I feel like we say that every year when we take our summer break that we're going to try and put out some content, and I don't think we've ever put out any significant content during that period. I think you've done a couple streams, but it never really happens how we plan, unfortunately.
To be fair, though, this year, I am going to a conference at the end of May, which is partially why it's ending a little bit earlier than some past years. And I'm hoping to cover some stuff out of that because it's going to be really cool. So yeah, bit of a potential spoiler if I do end up covering topics from that. But yeah, anyway.
Fair enough. And actually, relate to that, I figured I'd bring up. I think we're both planning to hit a DEF CON this year, and all the things going on in Vegas this summer. Part of that is we're thinking about putting out a shirt. I have a Spot the Bone shirt. It's something Spectre and I did quite a few years ago. We had our
2019.
yeah,
Yeah.
that feels about right. Had a little Spot the Bone t-shirt. I think we had an assembly bug on that. That said, I figure I kind of just ask if any of you guys have like a favorite Spot the Bone that we've had over all the phones that we've covered. Have a favorite, DM me or email, whatever. Get in contact. Let me know what phones you actually liked, and that might influence what ends up on a couple shirts we put out for it.
Yeah, so like Z said, we are planning to hit up DEF CON. I still have to, book flights and everything for that. I've been fairly lax on it. I should have done it already, but whatever. But yeah, we're hoping to be there, and if anybody wants to meet up or anything too, that would be cool. It's always fun to do that at the conferences. But yeah, so we'll jump into our topics here. Up first, we have some news that came out of Google, and it's around passkeys coming to Google accounts as a substitute for passwords. And we're revisiting something we haven't done for a while, and that's also wanting to address some of the misinformation that's been out around this topic. But yeah, Z, I'll let you cover this one.
Yeah, like Spectre said, it's been a while since we've kind of done one of these more news-ish topics and what's going on in security. But I'm somewhat excited about this. I love the idea of passkeys, and I'm relatively supportive here. I have a number of questions, some concerns, but just talking about what it is, like the idea or the fundamental idea of passkeys is using public keys as your authorization. So every website you go to, when you register, instead of registering with like username and password, they'll generate like a user ID for you, and you'll create or your browser. It'll part of what's going on here is it's having a lot more integration between the browser and like your hardware devices. This is like a 502 standard, so it is an open standard for doing all of this. But the idea being that every account you create, you're just creating a new private key. So you're not even sharing this private key. It's not one key signing a bunch of things. It's a new private key for every account, actually, not even just every website. But and then when you want to and then the server is only storing your public key, something that is intended to be public. You can share that pretty safely, doesn't compromise your private key. And then to log in, server gives you a challenge. You sign that challenge, or your browser will go through whatever all that. You don't manually have to do the signing yourself. But your public or your private key will be used to sign the challenge and give that back. So it's a way of verifying that you control that public key, or you have access to that public key or that private key, sorry. But the server doesn't need to store anything sensitive. Like if there's a breach, your passwords basically aren't impacted at all, because generally speaking, it's accepted that you can go from public key to private key. I mean, mathematically, it is possible to do it, but it is computationally very, very difficult to do it. And this is just what like fundamentally underlies HTTPS, like same deal, public keys, and you keep your private key secret. Uh, so it is a stronger password, and browsers have actually supported using private keys for authentication, doing this sort of thing for a while, but this is trying to make it a lot more user friendly. So fundamentally, though, the idea is to use keys for your authentication, which is just generally going to be stronger for everybody.
Yeah, suddenly password database dumps and stuff won't really matter or will fade to be relevant, assuming passkeys take over, which, I'm not going to delude myself into thinking that's going to happen anytime soon, but that is kind of the direction that it's looking to go.
Yeah, I mean, there's been pushes to use like the SERP-based auth for a good while. This is the first time, Apple first did this on their phones, and now Google's supporting it. Microsoft has support for it. So this is the first time where it feels like there is a good chance of gaining traction for it, and it is quite a bit more user friendly than some of the past solutions. The other times I've really used the past solutions have been in very corporate environments. Every laptop gets given the key, and then they're using that for their auth. Not really some that scale super well. I mean, it could, but in general, like it is better, I think, for users to say or to do this sort of thing, even though it feels less secure. The main thing is like the main risk for people is those password dumps. That has been the biggest risk for people, reusing passwords. So you have the password dump, then you reuse your password. That's a huge risk for like the average person. More tech savvy, password manager and all of that, probably not reusing the password, so it's really just the password dumps. This now takes away that. Now it's like if you want to compromise a password, you're compromising the device or the platform that is storing the passwords, which is
raising the bar significantly.
Yeah, it is raising the bar, but it is also where some of the concerns have. What control are we going to have over our passwords? Because another thing about this is, I believe like Microsoft's Hello and on Google and stuff, they're going to store these inside of like the trusted platform module, or at least they can. That's not mandated, but it is something mentioned. I believe I read that actually right off the spec that like ideally these things are being stored in secure, like cryptographic storage.
Which it totally makes sense because that is what they're designed for. Like there isn't much of a reason you should have direct knowledge of or like control over the private key. It should be stored securely. But yeah, it does seem to be where some of the concerns are coming from publicly. But like I said, like that's what they're designed for, and we've talked about Android secure key storage a few times on the podcast for too, and that rising as Android has had the version bumps. So yeah, it makes sense that would be in the spec for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would not like. So to clarify one of the misconceptions, I don't believe we're going to be locked into only using the TPM based storage or only like Google has control of your passkeys, which was the big thing with the Google announcements. A lot of people are like, well, I'm not going to have control over my passwords anymore. If Google locks me out of my account, I'm not going to have my passwords. KeyPass already has like a PR supporting this, like KeyPass XR or whatever, I think it was. I forget which one actually had it, but Dashlane already supports these. So third parties are able to implement this system so that you can use them instead of like Google. So it is fairly open in that sense. Bitwarden, so if you're looking for something you could self-host, Bitwarden doesn't support it yet, but it is something they are actively working on it. 1Password is also there. So like the password managers are jumping on this already because they don't want to be left out if you're not using passwords anymore. So that is kind of one of the biggest concerns I've seen is, well, this is Google trying to take control. I'm like, no, it seems like it's mainly just an aspect of this being too new, that this is a spec that is even like the oldest part of this particular spec, I think is only about 2 years old. And then some of the newer parts when it comes to like how the resident key works, which is a whole nother thing about how comes down to how the keys are stored, but also discoverability. So like if you create a key on your device or on your platform, other applications will be able to find that same key, so I can use the same key on Chrome and on Firefox. They're discoverable based off of who's looking for the key. Won't dive too much into that, but either way, it does seem like there will be open options, and I do agree with having a bit of hesitancy about everything just being like controlled by Google, Apple. And actually, Apple has mentioned that a developer for Apple, so Apple hasn't officially stated this, that keys will be exportable and importable. But it is like right now, it does feel kind of vendor lock-in. And I'm definitely not a fan with that. And I agree with anybody that has some hesitance about that. But it does seem like other things are getting on to actually implementing this too. The big platforms were just kind of the first ones to do it. And I think on the whole, having keys like this and locking the keys down, there's an attempt to lock them down a lot more just to the device. Which means like instead of sharing your password, you just add another, user, you add another key to your account so somebody else can log in. You can revoke that. There's maybe some extra options around there which sound a lot more convenient. It's going to depend on how things play out. Places like you have multiple keys, which they should, but we'll see how that goes. But yeah, one of the big things has been this vendor lock-in, so I kind of want to call it that. Doesn't look like this is actually going to be locked to Google, but it is something that they're obviously pushing, and their particular password manager, does end-to-end encryption on these keys. Another aspect I want to mention, and this is actually kind of a concern that built as I was digging into this. 2FA. So Google here lets you use these passkeys in place of 2FA. And the idea being that in order to unlock these passkeys, it's supposed to be on your platform using the platform authentication. And one of the options you have is you could set like a user verification as being required. You have to verify that the user is not just there, there's also a user presence option, but that the user can like unlock this thing. So on your phone, that would be like entering your PIN in order to actually use the credential. So it has extra protection on actually using these credentials, which is another big step up in security. So the idea is you have the passkey, and not only do you have it, but you also have the device that is able to access and like unlock. So you are getting the 2 steps of like a 2FA in there. You do kind of have to have either the knowledge or the way of unlocking. You have to have whatever that input is. Plus you need the actual key. So there are 2 things kind of going on there, which is fair. But I was trying to look into how do you actually verify that a user has performed user verification. And this kind of led me down some rabbit holes, and I'm not sure there's any defense. Like if you could steal the key, which is significantly harder, I'm not sure there's any defense against somebody just forking a browser, having their own like malicious authenticator in there that just uses the key and signs it. And just sends a request saying, oh yeah, this was totally user verified, because there's nothing that seems to be sent that you can actually verify that it was performed, except for the like JavaScript object that says, yes, it was performed. I was playing around in like the Auth0. They have this kind of debugger for the WebAuthn stuff, and that includes these keys. You can go through the whole process. You could see the responser, and that's where basically the only thing you'd get back is this, user verified true sort of deal. So feels like there might be some room for attack there, especially when you the attestation information is zeroed out by the browsers right now, so you can't actually validate like what the device was that used this. You can collect it, I believe, when you first. No, actually, my registration was coming back zeroed also. The attestation is basically your information about what device or what authenticator was used to create this or was used to sign this or whatever.
Like a fingerprint, yeah.
Yeah, well, it just provides a GUID, and then you have to go and look that up to get like their keys, and there's some process of like verifying that, but then you're not allowed to get the GUID in browsers, so it's not useful. I mean, maybe that's something that they'll support in the future. It's just not implemented right now. This is by spec.
That's what I assume, is that it's just not It's not there yet, but it will be.
Yeah, but like
Um,
even that, I mean, I guess if you could validate that key, then yes, I think you could validate like the MFA by saying yes, this was given by the right device because nobody's going to have the private key for that device except the device. Um, but that feels weak when it comes to like, how will Dashlane or something support such a thing if the key's just going to be somewhere because it needs to sign this extension, it's going to be somewhere perhaps attacker reachable or at least like attacker spoofable, or you install it on you, import the passkey on your own or something like that. Um, I don't know. The whole MFA aspect in theory is good because like it is having the phone, you're needing to do your fingerprint or whatever extra step to unlock it. Assuming you set that is an option here. You could set user verification as required versus discouraged. If it's discouraged, you're not getting the extra stuff. But yeah, I mean that is the one big concern I have right now is it actually MFA kind of safe? Part of this could just be my misunderstanding over some of it too. It is relatively new. I haven't really dug into it. But that is one concern. And for those of you who are actually wanting to attack this or running into this, there is like this isn't a like super or necessarily super secure system. I think we're going to see a lot of the same sort of issues you have with JWTs because what you're getting back here is a signature. It's just signed by the public key. The backend still needs to take that, needs to validate the key, needs to validate that the right algorithm was used, that the right key signed it, validate the chain and all of that. So like there's still a lot of places where things can go wrong in terms of auth. Or even, you might find that they check the key and see that matches, and then, they just trust the user ID reported, which is a separate thing, and then look up the wrong count. So there are places things can go wrong here. There's still kind of attacks you can go for with that. It's not inherently secure, but done right, there is a lot of security offered here. I mean, I'm excited to see it kind of take off, but definitely on the MFA front, I have some concerns from my own just looking at it.
Yeah, so that's kind of the other side of the blade, because at first blush you look at this and it's like, this looks like a pretty good step to take authentication and security as a whole. Like passwords have been the weakest link for a long time for compromises and stuff, and eliminating that is a good idea. And like using asymmetric crypto in this way, it almost seems obvious that it's like, why haven't we been doing this longer? But on the other side of it, passwords are very simple. People know how they work. It's not a hard concept to understand. It's pretty easy and mature to implement on the server side. Whereas when you're getting into passkeys and asymmetric crypto and verification, like you said, it does get more complicated to implement. And where you have complication, you typically also have more issues, whether they be like those logical issues of just forgetting to verify something properly, or just people like not really understanding how it's working and perhaps misconfiguring it or not configuring it as well as they could. It's kind of it's something where like most people aren't going to be diving into the spec to understand how it works, and so you kind of have to trust that it's being implemented properly by all parties. So I kind of understand the hesitation there. The other thing is too is it is kind of making the user or the device more of a single point of failure. So while it is raising the bar of how difficult it would be to recover a user's private key or whatever, it's making the user themselves a more enticing target. So it will. I feel, especially if passkeys really do take off and get widespread adoption, it is going to shift the attacker meta to getting that private key. And then once they do, especially if it's used on multiple services or whatever, you kind of have that issue with password managers where it's like, if your password manager is compromised, then like everything is compromised, so it's attached to it.
Yeah, so just
So
to be clear, like the passkeys will never be reused across multiple services, but you will have like the single device storing multiple passkeys. So
sorry,
your
that's what
point
I
still
meant.
stands, but
Yeah, it's a fair distinction though. um so yeah, there's kind of two sides to it. It will be interesting. I think overall it is going to be a net benefit. for the security front.
I mean, it requires targeting users, and that is an important distinction because the average user is getting
It is.
compromised with like credential stuffing. They're not getting compromised because I mean, some people are. Like their device was specifically hacked and, was targeting the secure element or something.
Most
It-
people aren't being targeted by nation states or something.
yeah, and I guess
Um,
it
most
is
people who are
worth
compromised are from the wide net sort of approaches of, the more black hat groups.
And it is worth knowing, like, these aren't supposed to be stored in a like unencrypted state. So, like, even if it is being stored as a flat file, it should still be encrypted, and that is still supposed to require like the user input or something to unlock it. So, be that just an encrypted blob on the file system where you enter your password to unlock it every time. Um, it is supposed to be something kind of in that vein when it comes to storage. Of course, places may store things insecurely. I don't think that's really enforced. That's just what the spec indicates should happen. Which means just compromising the device isn't necessarily enough. They do need to get that credential, but on like a desktop, it's easy to go from compromising the desktop to going or to like, key logging or something. On a mobile phone, that is a lot more difficult. And on that note, I was playing around with this, and while I was able to use passkeys.io, just like a test application, and I was able to create a key on my account. When I was playing around with the Auth0 debugger I opened earlier, I was playing around with this, and I tried using resident keys specifically. It actually forced me to use my phone to store them. I wouldn't store them using like Windows Hello. Uh, so that actually, one, that flow was really convenient to actually just say like, yeah, use my phone. It automatically like gave me the little notification to go through there and stuff. Really convenient process to actually do it, but that does mean that even my passkeys that I'm using on my computer are coming from like my phone. It's going back for there, and I have to go through the whole phone unlock. And the phone is, again, more difficult to compromise. So there is, something there too, but I don't completely understand the process going on here to make
Yeah.
any strong claims, but yeah.
And what you were saying with like compromising the device might not be enough on its own. Again, that's kind of where things like the TPM and whatnot come into play. And it's why they're being leveraged here.
Yeah,
So
steps up the bar like a ton.
for sure. So yeah, I think it's cool overall. I'll be interested to see, if there's some more information on this. And like you said, if it takes off and people use it, I could totally see some blog posts ending up on the podcast about it.
Does
But yeah.
remind me there are libraries already available that kind of do that validation, authentication of like checking the signing and stuff. That should be used. You shouldn't be trying to implement it yourself.
As per usual, don't roll your own crypto. Yeah.
Yeah, don't roll your own auth. Really. And that is something when you're talking about having to trust the implementation stuff. This is at least fairly standardized in terms of how it works. Passwords aren't. You can do whatever hashing you want. You can do whatever the heck you want with passwords. This has a lot more standardization to it, which at least makes it easier to like get information on how to do things, or may make it easier. It should, but we'll have to see how that actually works out.
That's a fair point. Yeah. Good. We've seen on the show how powerful just standardization on its own can be for having things implemented securely. So yeah, fair point. All right, so we'll get into our next topic here. Keeping up with things that have been garnering some attention lately.
Yeah,
Our
finally,
first,
an actual bug.
yeah, our first vuln of the episode is from checkmarks and is a bug in OpenAI that allowed getting unlimited credit for AI projects. So a bit of background here. Many of you likely have heard of and tried ChatGPT, and around launch it gave accounts that signed up for it a free credit to try AI projects. Of course, where this is tied to accounts, they wanted to prevent you from being able to easily just spam create a bunch of accounts to farm trial credits. And so they required email and phone number. And while email was fairly unchecked and you could just use, pick whatever email burner service you wanted, the phone verification was a bit harder. That's where they were kind of banking on preventing you from just farming these trial credits. So yeah, Checkmark started to look at the requests and whatnot and what was going on here. And what they found out was if you played with the phone number in a way that's that doesn't fundamentally change where the SMS verification would go, but it looks different. So things like prepending the country code or just prepending some zeros or whatever, it would allow you to register multiple accounts with, effectively the same phone number. And so, yeah, you could use the same phone number to get multiple accounts, farm those trial credits. So it was a pretty simple bug. Yeah, you could just keep adding like leading zeros. They also discovered some other ways too after using a fuzzer called recollapse. They found using like Unicode non ASCII characters in the phone number field would also work. Assumingly at the time of comparison when registering for the account, they just don't filter or normalize the phone number field before making that compare. So yeah, it's a somewhat simple bug. Interesting monetary implications for something like this though. Because AI is kind of taking off, and the use of OpenAI is kind of taking off in the corporate space. People are looking to make money off of it, and there is some high financial incentive to taking advantage of these trials instead of paying the subscription for to use the OpenAI stuff. So, bit of an interesting impact, and it's sort of a fun bug where it's you know it makes sense that messing with the phone number in this way could cause problems. Especially when you start factoring in country codes and stuff, it can be tough to deal with phone number as a format. It's not exactly like a strict format that you can apply strict filters on. So yeah,
Well, you should be able to apply a numeric filter. Um,
at least that, yeah.
I mean, you should be able to do that. Like, it does feel like they make the kind of educated guess about this being that they kind of just let you enter whatever phone number, making the assumption that the validation just won't happen if it's like a bad phone number, which is something that I generally recommend. Like, when it comes to sending emails, don't try and validate the email because emails are I have been locked out of so many places because my domain that I have for like my personal email has a dash in it. There have been so many places that are like, oh, there's a dash. That is not a valid URL character. And it is. I mean, it clearly is. A lot of places do that. But I've been locked out because of that. And if they would just send the email and see if I can get it, it would be fine. So doing that with the number, I get it. Like, that does kind of make sense. It's just in this case, it doesn't account for the fact that later on, probably, or at least they're assuming here, the actual sender tries to normalize and tries to handle invalid data, which is kind of another thought on, should you actually try and correct user input or just return an error? I lean towards requiring proper input and returning the error rather than trying to fix up user input. Although normalization does make sense in some cases, this feels like the sort of thing where, if they're sending in the Unicode characters, you really should just return like, hey, this isn't a phone number, not try and fix it. Which, again, presumably is what they're doing here. We don't actually know for sure how it worked, but I think it makes sense. So they've got here the early comparison for that probably happens in app logic versus the normalization happening like when they send it off to Twilio or something. I'm not exactly sure about that, but like happens much later down. It's something to keep in mind. And I actually think like testing phone numbers in this way is not something I've really done before. Maybe, those of you who've run into these sorts of verifications in your assessments have done that more. I haven't needed to assess these systems much, so I haven't done, but it is an interesting attack to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think it's a fair guess with what you were talking about with the comparisons and what they have in the blog posts. So yeah. So up next from Jubobs, we have a interesting CSRF chain in an undisclosed web app. So yeah, Z, I'll let you get into this one.
Yeah, this one is just kind of a fun chain. Nothing too crazy here, although it does go out of scope, which I thought was an interesting choice. But I kind of appreciate some of the information about the thought process, or like kind of how he looked around a bit. Oh no, it's some of it's there, some of it isn't. But it kind of starts off by recognizing within the in scope application, hey, there's this API here, and that API takes in the API is basically easily reachable. It's the cookie there is same site none and secure, so hit it over HTTPS, but otherwise, anybody can kind of make requests over to this API endpoint or trigger requests, so like CSRF style things. Of course, they have an anti-CSRF token, which normally you would fetch out of the slash profile endpoint, which is where they would get the CSRF token. So kind of a normalish process somewhere that gives you the token, and then you use the token. Fair enough. And that kind of leads to that profile endpoint had a very permissive CORS policy, which was the first sort of issue or step in the chain to notice or to discovering this. Is okay, there's a permissive CORS policy. Well, where it can reach that, and that's where they mentioned going out of scope. I guess I should clarify. All of the URLs in this are redacted. It's like inscope.redacted.com, redacted.com, and outofscope.redacted.com. So I'm just kind of referring to endpoints and out and in scope and stuff. The actual domains aren't revealed in the post. So if you're listing, that's kind of why I'm not sharing the actual website or anything about it, really. But anyway, so we have the profile endpoints. That's where you get the CSRF token. It has a permissive CORS policy. So of course you look, that's permissive. I can reach this from where? Where can I get this CSRF token from? Then the permissive CORS policy meant they could reach it from any of the redacted subdomains. Any subdomain from redacted.com could be used to reach this endpoint, which opens up the scope to actually disclosing that CSRF token. Again, anywhere can kind of reach the API, but you need that token. Any of the subdomains can get that token, so you need a vulnerability in one of those subdomains. That's where they mentioned being led out of scope to this out of scope subdomain, some sort of search system. It has this search endpoint, and on that search endpoint, they discovered a message handler, handles the incoming messages. Effectively, what it would do is it would just parse it out, and it would get a function name that's dot notation to go through the properties, and it would call whatever that function was on a window.app. So you'd provide like the app, foo, whatever, and it would call app.foo.bar.baz, and it would call that with the string argument that you provided. So basically gives you this on the window.app object. It would give you the ability to call any method on it. And so then they have to dig in, well, what can you call with this? They had a set cookie, which would usually be a little bit juicy, a little bit nice to have, but they couldn't find a way to exploit it. So instead, they found this API call, which you might get excited hearing that name, but it's not calling, the other API that we're talking about actually trying to get. It calls like search.redacted.com, and it calls it's a JSONP endpoint. JSONP, I don't feel like we've talked about very often on the podcast. And if an older tech, something that was used before just being able to update cores was more popular, really even supported. The idea there is you would set up kind of an endpoint, your API, and it was a way of kind of violating same-site origin because you could load scripts from another website. So to call like this remote API, you would call it as like a script source and whatever your request was, and you would put a callback parameter, and that parameter would be a function name. And so the response would just be JavaScript it would be a call to that function, and the first argument would be like the body or the response of the data you want, so it'd give you like a callback. So, I mean, it worked back in the day. There are better ways of doing that now, I'd argue, but it's still in use. And there have been a number of bugs just around JSONP. I remember playing, because you'd control like the first few bytes of a file, you could actually do some fun content sniffing things back before like no sniff headers were popular. There's a really old Flash attack that's really cool. If you Google JSONP Flash, you can come up with it. I definitely recommend digging into that, but that is completely unrelated to this post. I'm just reminiscing at this point. So anyway, you've got, coming back on topic, you've got this JSONP, or you've got this API call, and that makes a JSONP call. The JSONP, like the implementation of that, was fairly permissive. It didn't really do any validation over what your callback name was. And so in this case, what they could do is using a Actually, I guess I'll also mention there was a Akamai Web app firewall, which did block something trivial things. Like you couldn't make a call alert with whatever the response was going to be. You couldn't set your callback equals alert and do that. Akamai would catch that. So what they end up doing here is in creating that URL, it kind of does a poor job of it, and they were able to use a ampersand instead of the first question mark. Basically breaking, as I understand, that's kind of how they break the Akamai filtering, because it's parsed it incorrectly after that or whatever. Not actually sure about that. Or I'm not actually sure if that's exactly how that worked. But the gist of what happened here is they used a double URL encoding. So URL encode that callback function. URL encode that twice. It would get reflected out onto the page. And we actually have Jubobs in chat who says, I'm not sure either. So at least I'm not alone. So we end up with basically a JSONP call. That callback is your XSS. It calls any function you want in JavaScript, or it is arbitrary JavaScript because this is being loaded as a script, and it's not doing much verification. Double URL encoding was how they got basically any content in there. So yeah, it would basically just reflect whatever JavaScript they wanted. Kind of scrolling through here to find where they actually do it. They have like, their example here with document, trying to alert document load, as this is actually a better one here where they comment out the actual like function call of this, the error line. It's supposed to be making the function call here, which is this bit, but it's making the function call on a callback, which is this bit, which comments out the rest of it. Fun abuse of JSONP, super common and pretty old trick when it comes down to it. Like I said, JSONP used to be like a playground of random attacks like that. So it's fun to see it again. Anyway, so that gives them cross-site scripting here. You're able to give it, it loads the thing as a script, so it'll execute whatever you put in that callback. So you get your full chain. Putting it all together, there was one other problem here, and that is this out-of-scope domain / search page had the X-frame options, same origin, so you couldn't just toss this on an attacker page and frame it. The route they went for this was using a pop-up. So once a user has interacted with the page, if a user hasn't interacted with the page and you try and pop up, the browser gives you the pop-up warning and does all of that. If they have interacted with the page, then you can open a pop-up as long as there's been interaction. And from that, you'll have access to send messages to the window that you have in the pop-up. So it is a little bit more obvious than just a silent little frame on the page. Or actually, I'd say it's significantly more obvious than just a silent frame on the page. But it is, a valid method here. And in theory, you can maybe find, like, you could keep hunting for another bug, but it's enough to show, hey, there's a bug here, and, like, here's a full chain. So open the search page. It's the one with the bad message parser. You open up that search page, and from there, you make the API call, or you send the message that causes the API call. API call gets you XSS. XSS you could then use. Now you've got cross-site scripting, and like you can make arbitrary requests. The origin being this search domain. You can now hit that profile page, which has the CSRF token, steal the CSRF token, and use that against the API. So it's a long chain, has some complexities to it, and they got paid out just $200. I was going to say 2,000. Euro or pound. I'm pretty sure that's euro, but I never remember because they're both kind of that E symbol, and I don't work with either very often. Fairly small bounty for the actual payout, although I get, that Mr. Gabe mentioned, a lot of work for only 200. Definitely is, I agree. Same time, I feel like this is like user interaction required, vulnerability on an out-of-scope domain. I could understand where they maybe call it back a little bit. It's a cool chain.
Some extenuating circumstances, unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, and they didn't provide any justification, which I mean I hate with bounty programs that aren't communicative, but yeah, they kind of call it out themselves there. Unfortunately, the gnarliest bug chains don't always turn out to be lucrative. Um, in this case, like I feel like there are some of those uh mitigating factors to it that I can understand, especially if this, like on a whole, as a bounty program, if they weren't a huge, um, if they weren't paying out huge bounties to begin with, like I don't know where this lands on their normal scale. Like if they normally pay out like $30,000 and there's just this 200 one or what, but either way, the chain was cool, and I appreciate kind of having to walk through the thought process as they dug into everything. It's good insight to have about, approaching it and how you jump around rather than this just being a post of I found this and this and chained them this way. Like having that logic in there definitely I think helps with, coming up with your own ideas and how you might approach these scenarios.
It's always nice to see methodology. Yeah. So yeah, despite the low payout, it was a cool complex chain. I actually, while you were covering the post, I took a look to see when the last time we covered a topic that had JSONP in it was. That was actually episode 173, and it was a XSS on League of Legends, the League of Legends account page through EasyXDM. So yeah, it's been a little while, but last time we saw it was in a fairly high profile domain. So um,
Yeah, and
yeah,
I'm
you
not
can
sure
check
if
out
that
that one
one.
for. I think we talked about that one a little bit. We brought up JSONP a little bit there too, like some of the background on it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that one actually had like the vulnerability that what I'd kind of refer to as a JSONP way, or if JSONP was just kind of a side effect. And yeah, like there are still reasons to use JSONP. I'm kind of talking about like it's an old tech mostly because like in it had its prime. I think it is past its prime, but it's still used. But I don't think that one was really a JSONP like issue. It was just an issue and it happened to be JSONP.
Well, basically they took advantage of JSONP. So
Okay, then I'm just
like
misremembering
basically,
it.
yeah, they took advantage of a jQuery feature where if the jQuery request URI ended in like an equals question mark, it would try to load it as a JSONP call. So yeah, it was kind of like a technique they used to exploit it. But that
Oh,
was the last
right.
time we talked about it. So figured I'd bring it up quickly. But yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I'll add Jubobs mentions that the critical on this program pays out 2,000 euros. So getting 10% of like the max payout, presumably max payout there. Given the sorts of issues here, I think like the big mitigating thing is actually the out of scope. The fact that it does go out of scope on the bounty program, like it is a vulnerability in the out of scope domain. I'd always prefer to see a bounty. So to be clear, I would always prefer bounty programs just pay out based on the bug, regardless of scoping it, because attackers aren't looking at, oh well, this is out of scope, so we better not attack there. Um,
Yeah, they don't care
yeah.
unless
So
they're
like,
submitting to the bounty program themselves.
yeah. So I don't think that like that should be a huge thing, but I get it from the company side for downgrading it on that basis, being about um Jubobs mentions, but to attack an in-scope asset, so they should care. I know where you're coming from, and I agree with you. Like they should care, but I also kind of see the other side of company being like, no, this starts out of scope. The root cause of this is that API, and calling the root cause of it the API call, not the permissive cores value. Like I could see the perspective is all I'm getting at. I'd always like to see bounties paid more though, regardless.
Yeah. All right. So
Except big
getting in.
bounties. Don't need to pay them more. Sorry.
Yeah. It's been a while since we talked about bag bounties. I kind of forgot about them. To be honest, we should skip over them these days. Yeah. So getting into our last topic, we have a post by Asset Note on an order of operations bug that leads to a pre-auth RCE in Oracle Opera, which is a popular software suite used by hotels and resorts and whatnot. And it manages personal information, including credit card info. So it's quite a lucrative treasure trove to try to go after. The service they ended up zoning in on here was the file receiver servlet for receiving files. Makes sense as it's typically the more dangerous functionalities to support. When looking at the servlet, they found multiple params that would come from untrusted from an attacker, including file name, CRC, GNDI name, and username. And the GNDI name and username were encrypted with DES. So it'll try to decrypt it. Problem is, as you can guess, with the title being an order of operations bug, instead of decrypting and then sanitizing the data, they sanitize before decrypting. So they're only sanitizing the encrypted payload, which doesn't really do very much. So yeah, the decrypted payload is of course not sanitized, which when those variables are used to build the path to where to write the file to, it can allow you to get an arbitrary file right when it initializes the file and whatnot. Now, of course, there are some obstacles here you have to overcome. For one thing, the JNDI name and username are encrypted, and so as an attacker, you would need the key to be able to encrypt your own malicious payload. At least if you wanted to have a decent amount of control over it.
So
And
you
the
would
other
need
thing
the
is,
key. Another option is if you had some sort of oracle, something that, like the username, I imagine you could register with the more malicious username potentially. That would be kind of an oracle for it. I guess it would be a reverse oracle, I guess. I usually think of oracle in the other direction where it's providing you kind of decrypted information from the encrypted, but similar idea here, control over some of the encrypted information. There are other ways you could go about it, but they had a fairly nice way in this one, or in this post.
yeah. The other obstacle they had to overcome was they needed to know the JNDI connection name. Um, I don't remember exactly where the check is, or I'd bring it up here, but yeah, they needed that connection name. Fortunately for them, they found a solution to both. For the connection name, they could simply visit a few unauthenticated endpoints like the CRS status or export receiver, and it would just display the JNDI connection name and the response. And for encryption, as you could probably guess, the encryption just consisted of static keys. And where it's symmetric DES, it's enough to enable the attack. You just pull the keys, and you're able to both decrypt and encrypt those parameters. So yeah,
Let's
it's
just say
coming back to an
using,
old classic of static keys. It's fun. It's been a while, but it's definitely not gone away.
yeah, I mean, static keys, it's so common. We don't tend to cover it, but there's a lot of reports that are just, static keys. Using the other thing here is they're using DES. Like, this isn't AES, this is DES.
I found that
Um,
interesting too. That's
like, before, so data encryption standard was like the standard before AES was a thing. Before AES kind of won that competition and became AES. So Rinendell, or however you say his name, doesn't matter. After they're using that too is, I don't know, maybe it's something to do with medical field and they're always slow moving, but that feels really, really slow here. Like, I'm sure AES is allowed to be used, so that choice here is weird. I found the bug kind of interesting though, because it feels like the sort of thing that got introduced by, they originally would have just had this request get parameters bit. Like, I feel like originally the code would have just been using that. It would have just been JNDI name equals request.get parameters, and then somebody implemented this sanitizer and is like search and replace all request.get parameters, and add sanitize parameter, like just adding in this string before it without any concern over how it's used. And thus, because they just replaced that bit, they missed the fact that this was kind of getting decrypted. It's a really weird bug because I feel like any human reading that would understand you want to do the sanitization afterwards. So I could only imagine it being introduced because of some automated aspect.
To be fair, I could totally see someone being like, "Oh, we have to deal with the encryption that we're adding around this parameter. Just decrypt it, and then
Yeah.
kind of like tunnel visioning on the decryption aspect, and not even considering the order of how you're sanitizing it. I could see it being a fairly easy mistake to make, even manually.
Yeah, okay, I guess if you're just adding in there, it still feels like the sort of thing that you should recognize, but yeah, okay, it's believable at least, but it is one of those bugs that um yeah, Theft Mystery mentions death for a newer developer. They also mention, I think AES has to be used now according to high tech law. So, I mean, this isn't patient information, so I'm not sure like if that
Well, it's not in the health
changes.
sector. I think you accidentally mentioned something about the health sector. This is in like the hotels and resorts stuff, so it's not.
Oh, why was I thinking this was health sector? I'm sorry. For some
Well, a
reason,
lot of the times when we cover these types of software, it is in the health industry. But yeah, in this case, it's hotels and stuff
oh,
like that.
my bad. Yeah, I guess it does say used by Microsoft largest hotel resort chain. Yeah, for some reason I could have sworn this was a medical thing that was mentioned somewhere, but apparently I just read into it. I do agree with this little or alt title here. The website or web app is giving off some GeoCities vibes. Actually, maybe that's why it reminds me of a medical app I did an assessment against once upon a time.
Yeah, it has some '90s movie vibes on that website. It's like what you see in Jurassic Park or something.
Even like
But
these buttons, like get Acrobat Reader. Like, yeah, I mean, we don't need to make fun of the design, but yeah, there's definitely some older design concepts going on here.
I'll put it this way: there's a lot of red flag when you look at this software, and you're like, yeah, I can see why these types of issues exist. So yeah, like the use of DES, the ancient software and whatnot. But yeah, this sort of out of like operations issue, it is fun to talk about because it is more of those logical type flaws. Um, it's it's something that I'm not sure how easily you could catch this in automated testing. Perhaps you could, especially if you're factoring in the encryption. I guess in your testing, you could probably catch it pretty easily. But yeah, this is just something that skipped by, and it led to kind of an interesting attack. And of course, like I said, it's quite impactful because not only are you attacking something that's storing customer data, including payment information, but it's also pre-auth RCE. So yeah, it's quite an impactful attack. But yeah, that's pretty much all on that topic. Z, I believe you have a shout out to get into, so I'll let you touch on that, and then we'll end the episode.
Yeah, they don't call it any vulnerabilities here, so I didn't want to cover this as a full topic, but Doyanosec or Doyansec, sorry. I probably still didn't say that right, but testing zero touch production platforms and safe proxies. I thought it was a cool post, kind of basically threat modeling and just looking over what are some of the things that you can look for when looking at these applications. So it's worth a read over, especially if you are going to be, if you're on engagement, you run into this, whatever. I figure it's worth the post. I want to at least call out that this exists because I haven't seen anybody else really covering these, so worth giving a read, taking a look at. But yeah, no vulnerabilities for us to cover, so can't really go into that, and way too many issues to kind of talk about too. But yeah, it's worth a quick read over to at least give you the high level attack surface.
All right, so that's everything that we have for this episode. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. Previous episodes can be found on Twitch, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more off Anchor. Discord and Twitter links are also down below or in the chat for anyone who wants to join the discussion. And we'll be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific for the binary topics, which is also where we'll cover the spot the vuln, and we'll see you then.